Welcome back to the channel. Today we are entering the arena and asking, are you not entertained? Because we're talking about gladiators. It's a gladiator joke. I mean, you get it. Let's do it. Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise, everyone. My name, as always, is Trevi, and today we are doing another datasheet deep dive into the 3 gladiator variants. Today, we're going to be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of this particular armored vehicle, the differences between the 3 loadouts, a look at all of the synergies within the Space Marine Codex and in all of the Space Marine sub-factions as well, and talking about which one is best of the 3. Before we get into the video, I want to give a quick reminder to anybody who hasn't subscribed to the channel yet and likes this content. Please go ahead and drop one of those subscriptions. That would be sick. We also have a new channel membership you can find at the join button underneath the video. That will give you access to some sweet channel badges and emojis, and that helps support me create more content, run the T5S2 tournament series in the community Discord, and run live streams for competitive online 40K. So any support that you can give is greatly appreciated, and you get a cool little badge for your comments, and you get some cool emojis. Once we get a couple people to sign up, we'll be able to unlock even more emojis for the channel, so that's super exciting. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's talk about some data sheets. First off, let's talk about the base stat block for the Gladiator. It's nominally built off an Impulsor chassis, so you sort of could think that it would have a similar stat line to an Impulsor, but you'd be wrong. I guess they took out the big engines that the Impulsor have and just replaced them with guns and armor plating, which, I mean, I guess it's fair. It is a battle tank, so that makes sense. Instead of the move 14 that we got with the Impulsor, we have a relatively tepid move of 10, which is a little bit disappointing. This thing is going to chug along just about as fast as a Repulsor or a Repulsor Executioner, so that's not a very inspiring speed value, to be honest. However, it makes up for it in this excellent toughness value of 8, which means that it's going to be in line with most other main battle tank equivalents, things like Lehman Russ and the repulsors that I just talked about. That means that a lot of anti-tank weapons are going to bounce off of that big old toughness value pretty consistently. Multi-meltas and meltas need a 4 to wound them. Strength 4 weapons like auto cannons need as much as a 5, and even little strength 4 bolter shots are going to be wounding them on 6. So that is a perfect toughness value for the discerning main battle tank owner. Other than that, their base stat line isn't very exciting. They do have relatively average 3+ armor save, and unfortunately, no additional inbuilt defensive tech. That said, all 3 variants can equip the same 3 upgrades. They can all take auto launchers. Auto launchers are a big deal because that gives them access to that smokescreen keyword. That allows you to use the smokescreen stratagem, appropriately named, when they're targeted by an enemy attack and be -1 to hit. Now, these guys, as we'll talk about in a second, are very expensive. They're big, beefy tanks, and I think you're almost always going to want to have access to that smokescreen ability. So almost in any build whatsoever, I would equip the auto launchers almost immediately. The Iron Hail Heavy Stubber is a pretty decent anti-infantry gun, just a strength 4 and a couple shots at -1 AP. We also have an Icarus Rocket Pod, which is a little bit buffed from its 8th edition incarnation. It no longer gets -1 to hit non-flyers, so instead, it's basically just like stapling an autocannon to your vehicle for 5 points, which is quite a deal. It gets +1 to hit if it's shooting at aircraft, which is nice, and it's firing D3 Strength 7, -1 AP 2 damage shots, which is a very nice stat line, especially if you're firing into Primaris and want to be knocking those guys off pretty quickly. So I do think that both of those upgrades are usually worth it, especially for big battle tank equivalents like this. If you want to put all your eggs in the basket, because this is already a big, expensive unit, so you want it to be able to do the most damage every time it fires its guns, and you're already incentivized to protect it and keep it alive, so making it a little bit more expensive doesn't really sort of change the paradigm that much. So these extra weapon upgrades, if you have the points for them, I would consider taking them. The auto launchers, I would basically consider to be an auto include. I would staple those right on top of the cost as often as I could. Now, we do have 3 different variants of the Gladiator. We have the Lancer, which we have pictured here. This is basically the most well-rounded variant of the 3, and has a bit more of a focus on long-range engagement. That's thanks to its Lancer Laser Destroyer, a turret weapon, which is firing 2 shots at a big old strength 10 AP3 flat D3 +3 damage. So that is a hefty profile, to say the least. It's even buffed a little bit farther with its Aquilon optics, which give it +1 to hit with that weapon, so it's going to be hitting on 2s. One thing we'll talk about later in the video is that trying to source rerolls or bonuses to hit for these guys is very important, and fortunately the Lancer has that built in with that rule, so it's not going to need as much to try to get bonuses to hit for itself. It does have a couple other weapons tacked on. Those aren't affected by the Aquilon optics, it's just the laser cannon that is. It's come stock with storm bolters, so potentially 4 or 8 shots if you're in close range. Remember, this is a vehicle, so it doesn't benefit from bolter disciplines. You can switch those for a Fragstorm grenade launcher for a D6 blast instead of just the flat 2. I think generally the storm bolters are better because their maximum range is a little longer, so you're going to more often be able to fire them, but really it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen the other. The switch isn't really that big of a deal. The Lancer comes in at 11 power level and a hefty points cost of 200 points, which is quite a price tag on this guy for basically just a 2-shot laser destroyer, which is, I mean, it's a good gun, but is it a 200-point good gun? I don't know. The scary part is that the Lancer is also the cheapest of them, so let's move on to the other variants. Next up, we have the Reaper, which is the middle child of the 3 and is focused entirely on sweeping swaths of infantry directly off the table into the garbage can. This thing is rocking on its turret weapon a twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, firing 24 strength 6 shots at -1 AP. That's crazy. That's so much damage. But it gets even better because it has a Tempest bolter mounted on its side, or 2 Tempest bolters, I should say. And these things are basically the little brother of a Hurricane bolter. They do come in at a base range of 30 and a straight AP of -1. So I guess it's basically 4 bolt rifles stuck together, if that makes sense. And when we're in optimal range for them, that puts the Reaper up to firing 40 shots between strength 6 and strength 4, able to wipe enormous swaths of infantry off the table. It's just gonna kill so many models. This guy is missing the Aquilon optics keyword, so it does not get the +1 to hit, and I think the Reaper, out of all 3, really wants a bonus to hit out of all of them, so if you have access to an effect like that, this is probably where it's gonna be going. The Reaper comes in at 12 power level and 230 points, so we are increasing steadily in points cost. That increase is continued with the Gladiator Valiant, the last one, the big brother of the 3 triplets, and the Valiant is keyed, unlike the Reaper, entirely towards destroying enemy armor. It's gonna crush through so many vehicles. It has a twin Las Talon as its turret weapon, which comes in at 4 shots at a Las Cannon profile, strength 9, AP3, D6 damage, and its sponson weapons are both multi-meltas. So at that 24-inch range, it's also going to be firing 4 additional strength 8, AP4, D6 damage with a potential D6 +2 if it gets within that 12-inch sweet spot for those for that melter rule. Again, the Valiant does not have the Aquilon optics ability, so unlike the Lancer, this one's anti-tank weapons are going to be a little bit more inaccurate, and again, it's probably going to want to be sourcing a buff to hit somewhere. The Valiant comes in at 13 power level and 250 points. Definitely the most expensive of the 3, but it does make up for it in the sheer amount of damage it can pump into a single target. Now, I mentioned it a little bit before when we talked about the auto launchers, but given the expense of these models, a big part of synergizing them with your list is gonna be putting defensive buffs on them to keep them alive. Now, talking about the keywords that these vehicles bring with them, they're coming in, obviously they're vehicles and they're gladiators, and they have the repulsor field keyword. That gives them access to the grav flux stratagem, so that's a big deal. They'll also get access, like we mentioned before, to that smoke screen stratagem if they equip those auto launchers, which I think they should be. What they're missing is a couple important things. First one being a Power of the Machine Spirit. They don't have that, unlike Land Raiders, so they don't unlock the Power of the Machine Spirit stratagem to act at top profile. Very unfortunate for them. Both Land Raiders and standard repulsors have those, but the Gladiators, I guess, couldn't fit in the computer to be taken over by an autopilot. They're also, more importantly, missing the core keyword. So just like the Invader ATVs that we talked about in the last video, these guys are not going to be benefiting from any, or I should say most of your aura abilities. Your Chaplain's not going to work on them. A Tactical Precision, Rites of Battle, your Chapter Master buff, none of them are going to work on any of these Gladiators. So when we're looking to synergize them with our list, one thing that we're going to try to be doing is sourcing those rerolls from elsewhere. Obviously, the Lancer already has them built into its profile, but the other variants don't, and we'll have to look for some places to get that +1 to hit or some rerolls. Fortunately, there's some places to do it in the Space Marine faction. Given the expense of these units, they're going to be a big fire magnet. And another key part of synergizing them with your list is going to be keeping them alive to keep shooting and recouping that cost. So the other thing that we're going to be looking at is survivability. We're going to be trying to put buffs on them to make that T8 really work for us and make that unit as difficult to kill as possible. Now, before we get into talking about specific synergies within the Space Marine Codex and within all of the other chapters, I want to get something off my chest, everyone. I'm just going to talk about it now, and then for the rest of the video, we can just forget about it, and I don't have to keep harping on it. And that thing is the main source of competition that's going to be competing with units like these Gladiators and these big, heavy tank unit archetypes within the Space Marine faction, and that is Dreadnoughts. And Dreadnoughts have a couple very key advantages over tanks. Tanks tend to be upgunned a little bit compared to a Dreadnought. They typically take more guns. They're a little bit more specialized, whereas Dreadnoughts are sometimes locked into specific war gear loadouts that are a little bit wonky. Whereas if we look at something like the Reaper, it's very, very good at killing infantry. The Valiant is very, very good at killing tanks, and they're very hyper-focused. That said, Dreadnoughts have a couple key features that give them a leg up over tanks. Those are the Dreadnought keyword in and of itself that unlocks Wisdom of the Ancients as a stratagem, which is a big deal. That allows them to project their own Rites of Battle or Tactical Precision aura if they want to, which is awesome. In addition, Dreadnoughts have the core keyword, so not only can they create that aura, they can also benefit from it. They can also benefit from a lot of stratagems. Things like Crucible of Battle would not work on them otherwise, but it does because they have core, so that's sick. And in their profile, they have baked in Duty Eternal, so attacks against them are always at -1 damage. That makes them, even though their defensive stats aren't typically as good as repulsors, that does make them much more difficult to kill. So in comparison, tanks are a little bit squishier. They aren't quite as efficient on their attacks because they don't have access to that same level of support from the rest of the army. And they're both vehicles, so almost every vehicle synergy in the faction works on Dreadnoughts as well as tanks. So if you're trying to build those vehicle synergies into your army, you're almost always better off looking at the Dreadnought archetypes rather than these big tanks. But if you are trying to fit a Gladiator into your list, we have some ways to do it, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Regardless of whether or not a Dreadnought would be, better for your list, or a Dreadnought list would be better than a Gladiator list, if you want to take a Gladiator, that's why we're here. So let's talk about some synergies that we can use to make this tank work in your Space Marine army. So looking through the Space Marine book itself for some synergies, we have a couple that are pretty apparent. A smokescreen I already mentioned, that's an important one if you have those auto launchers equipped, which you probably should. So keep that in mind. We're going to be talking about that a lot in comparison to other effects as we go throughout this whole video. Armor of Contempt is a vehicle-specific one. When you take mortal wounds, you can pop it for 1 CP and ignore those mortal wounds on a 5+. That's great. One of the ways your opponent's going to be getting through that toughness 8 is using mortal wounds, things like smites and Catan powers to try to just dump raw damage onto those tanks without having to make those tough wound rolls. And Armor of Contempt is a perfect tool to have. Just don't forget about it. I see a lot of people just forget their Armor of Contempt when they're about to eat a bunch of smites from a Grey Knight's army or something like that. Don't do that. Make sure you use it and ignore a bunch of that damage. Given that they have that repulsor vehicle keyword, they also have Grav Pulse available, and this is perfect for the Gladiator for 2 reasons. First off, it allows you to fall back and shoot, so that's great. You don't have to get stuck in melee to fire your guns. You can just fall back for 1 CP, pop that stratagem off, and keep going. You don't have to source fall back and shoot from anywhere else. We don't have to be looking at Ultramarines or anything like that to try to jam fall back and shoot into our army to make these guys work. So Grav Pulse is a really good tool. The alternative use of Grav Pulse is to give your opponent -2 to charge, and while it's not super good to be sort of leading the charge with these tanks because they're so expensive and they will go down to sustained firepower. Only 12 wounds is not that many wounds, so they're going to die eventually regardless of how many defensive buffs you put on them. But in some situations, it is going to be useful for this Gladiator to be able to screen out charges, and that Grav Pulse stratagem is one of the best tools it has to do that. If you have a Lancer like sitting in your back line and your opponent's able to bring in reserves or deep strikers or teleporters in to try to charge into you, if they declare that Lancer, then, I mean, you're going to give them -2 to charge, so they probably won't be able to do that. So you can sort of use the Gladiators to zone out areas where your opponent's melee units will have a very tough time getting to grips with your army. It's a little bit more corner case, but it's something that may come up. Going into Psychic powers, Psychic Fortress, I mentioned it in the ATV video, but it also works here. You just pick anything and you give it a 5+ invulnerable save. That's exactly what we want on these big, tough units. Almost any anti-tank firepower is going to be punching through that 3+ save pretty easily, so getting a 5+ invulnerable save makes it so that they don't sort of immediately die to things like Eradicators or las cannons. They have a little bit more of a safety cushion there. We also have a bunch of different ways to repair them, and obviously, I mean, we're talking about vehicles, so one of the things that you really want to have in your army if you're playing a vehicle-centric list is those Tech Marines. We have Master of the Forge. Unfortunately, not many of the Master of the Forge abilities really affect Gladiators, but repairing flat 3 wounds for that upgrade is sometimes pretty useful. The big headliner here is the Primaris Tech Marine. This guy's new in the new Space Marine Codex, and oh boy, is he a tasty treat. He's got an excellent profile just as a Tech Marine himself. He's got a sweet gun that he, like, on his shoulder that he can shoot. That's really cool, but also he has an aura where he just picks something within 3 inches and gives it +1 to hit, a vehicle specifically. And that you can just do that on a Gladiator. So we've done it, everyone. The video's over. We've sourced our +1 to hit. Our Gladiator Reapers and our Valiants can hit really reliably now. All we need to do is bring this Primaris Tech Marine. All done. Wrap it up. We're good to go here. For real, though, this guy's sick, and I think any list that is based around vehicles will absolutely bring 1 or more Primaris Tech Marine. You can't affect the same vehicle with their aura more than once per turn, but if you have a bunch of vehicles, you can give them all +1 to hit. So why not? Let's do it. If you're building in Successor Chapters, there are a couple Successor Chapter traits that are okay for vehicles. Scions of the Forge gives you the Iron Hands chapter tactic, essentially, for bracketing, so you double the number of wounds that you have on your profile when you're determining whether you're bracketed. That means for the Gladiator, they actually have a pretty favorable profile for that, and you have to get them down to 3 wounds before they're even on their second bracket. You have to deal 9 damage to this Toughness 8 vehicle to give it -1 to hit, as long as they have that buff. We talked about Armor of Contempt earlier. Warded is also pretty good for heavily armored lists that are susceptible to mortal wounds. It just gives you Armor of Contempt all the time for your whole army. You just always ignore mortal wounds on a 5+. It's not a great ability, but it is a pretty good blanket to have to make you take a little bit less damage from those smites. It even lets you save against explosions, which is kind of fun. So if your vehicles start blowing up on each other, they don't hurt each other quite as much. And for any vehicle army, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Master Artisans. It's a pale shadow of what it was in 8th edition, but because you're bringing a lot of individual vehicles, if you're taking multiple Gladiators, that is, and each of them has, you know, a couple high-value attacks, getting that 1 full reroll to hit every time they shoot is actually a pretty big deal, because it tends to cascade in value the more individual units you have. Now moving on to the chapter-specific synergies. I'm actually going to go ahead and gloss right over a bunch of these chapters. Unfortunately, they just don't have much going for them. Either they don't have a lot of vehicle-specific synergies, or there's not really much in there. Blood Angels, Raven Guard, Flesh Terrors, none of them really do much with vehicles. Space Wolves can give reroll 1s to wound with the Mordekai's Teeth Bolts. That's nice. Black Templars can give them a 4+ invulnerable save with the Aurelian Shroud for 1 turn. That could be good for blunting an Alpha Strike. You can use it to soak a bunch of damage on your opponent's like big heavy anti-tank shooting, but it is only 1 turn, and unfortunately Black Templars don't really have anything else that synergizes with these guys. Deathwatch also has, I mean, they have like no synergies with anybody ever, so that's a little sad, but they do give a lot of rerolls. They give you reroll 1s to hit against Xenos, which is nice to have. They also give you reroll 1s to wound against a specific battlefield roll. I feel like that's important to mention since vehicles typically don't have very good access to rerolls, but it's not a particularly exciting buff. Once we get to White Scars, though, that's where things get a little bit interesting. First off, it gives these guys access to Hunter's Fusillade, which allows them to advance and fire their weapons as assault weapons. If you're playing pure White Scars, that also means that you ignore the penalty for advancing and shooting. So you just get, especially on the Valiant, you just get to advance and fire all your guns with no penalty. Now, I should mention, however, that does mean that the Gladiator and the Reaper are a little hindered when they decide to advance and shoot. A lot of their weapons are rapid fire weapons, and so those are predicated on doubling their attacks thanks to the rapid fire roll when they're within 12 inches, or half range, I should say. But those just turn into assault weapons if you use the Hunter's Fusillade ability on them, so they will not double their attacks, even if they're at half range. So there is a little bit of a downside to using it on the Reaper specifically. The other really really cool synergy that White Scars have with any big tank, and the Gladiator included. So that's their special strategic reserve ability that for 1 CP lets you reserve anything in the army and bring it in on a table edge, just like a normal strategic reserve, except you can bring it in on any table edge starting at turn 2. You're not restricted to deploying outside of your opponent's deployment zone. For the shorter range variants of the Gladiator, this is actually sick. For the Reaper and the Valiant, ramming one of these into your opponent's flank on turn 2 and just, letting loose, acting as this enormous distraction carnifex and soaking a bunch of firepower is a big deal. And if your opponent has their anti-tank wrapped up in short-range units or in melee units, sometimes they can be caught out of position by outflanking one of these, big toughness 8 vehicles where they don't have immediate access to the tools that they need. I think there's some potential here for the Gladiator to pop in and do some work with White Scars, specifically for that encirclement, I think, is actually really cool. Moving over to Ultramarines, not a lot of synergy here. A lot of their buffs are affected only on core units, but I should mention that Martial Precision is a really good effect to have if you're running the Lancer specifically. The Valiant, a little bit less so, but it is a really good stratagem to keep in the bank if you need to guarantee those big, heavy laser shots go down, especially on a target that has innate penalties to hit built into it, so like an aircraft or something similar. Being able to guarantee that you get one hit automatically through is very nice. There's not really any rerolls or other buffs to hit that Ultramarines can give you. You can try to trick somebody into killing a unit of incursors with their big thing and then avenge the fallen on them to reroll ones. That's kind of cute, I guess, but it's a little convoluted. But the headliner every time we talk about Ultramarines is rapid redeployment, and that it especially goes for these big tanks. I think the advantages of a redeployment strat like this are pretty evident, but I do think that it benefits units like the Gladiator a little bit more than it does a lot of other unit archetypes. Salamanders have a lot of obvious synergy with a unit like the Gladiator. Obviously, their chapter tactic for the reroll 1 wound roll is excellent for an army focused on vehicles, because vehicles can bring a lot of single model units with a low volume but very high impact weapons, and getting that 1 wound roll in the bank so that you can guarantee that those big laser cannons or multi-melta shots go through is a big deal. On these big toughness 8 vehicles as well, a lot of anti-tank weaponry, especially high volume anti-tank weaponry like heavy bolters or autocannons, comes in at AP1, so that forged in battle bonus to ignore AP1 is actually a pretty big deal as well. Not to mention that on the Valiant specifically, the Melta synergy with their Super Doctrine to get +1 to wound on Meltas helps those 4 multi-Melta shots that thing is packing pretty well. On top of that, Salamanders also bring some excellent psychic powers to buff vehicles in Drakeskin and Fire Shield. We talked about these a little bit in the ATV deep dive, but they are even more important for the Gladiators. I think Drakeskin specifically, it's one of the only ways to increase the toughness value, I think actually the only way to increase the toughness value of a vehicle unit in the faction right now, outside of Might of Heroes on a Dreadnought. Unfortunately now, Might of Heroes does require core or character, so you can't put it on the Gladiators, but you can still put Drakeskin on them. And that brings them to the glorious toughness of 9, which is a really good breakoff point for a lot of anti-tank weaponry, especially things like Meltaguns and las cannons, which are very popular right now. Meltaguns wounding on 5s is a really big deal and makes a lot of those Eradicator shots bounce right off, and las cannons wounding on 4s is another nice swing point to have. Fire Shield gives you -1 to hit, which doesn't stack really well with Smoke Screen, so there's not a lot of synergy there, but it can be combined with Grav Pulse for a total of -3 to charge. So if you are leading the charge with one of these Gladiators and your opponent's trying to get to grips with it, giving them -3 to charge actually makes a lot of really easy charges, in fact, very difficult. Imperial Fists have some nice benefits for vehicles as well. Torgaradon is another access to that +1 to hit Sigma Ray effect, just like the Primaris Tech Marine, so you can use him to get another source of that effect if you need it. The Imperial Fist Super Doctrine also affects the Lancer and the Valiant pretty well. It does give them +1 damage against vehicles during the Devastator Doctrine, so that's nice. Unfortunately, it does require you to be Strength 7, so it doesn't impact the Reaper's Gatling Cannons, which is pretty sad. I think that thing ripping tanks off the table would have been pretty nice, but unfortunately, no. If you do want to take tanks off the table with the Reaper, you do have access to Tank Hunters in Imperial Fist for full reroll to wounds against 1 enemy vehicle, which is pretty nice. It is a little expensive at 2 CP, but you can use it on one of these Gladiators if you really want to. And if you take some damage, you also have Fortify as a psychic power to help repair these guys, in addition to whatever your Tech Marine's doing. Dark Angels also have some pretty relevant effects, but unfortunately, they don't really stack very well with other effects that are available for the Gladiator. You can get extra range from their Super Doctrine in the Devastator Doctrine, and you can use Brilliant Tactician to set them back to Devastator Doctrine for an additional turn, which is very relevant, especially on the Reaper and the Valiant. That also makes it easier for them to trigger the Chapter Tactic to get +1 to hit if they stand still, but obviously that doesn't stack very well with any other +1 to hit effects, so you could just be bringing up Primaris Tech Marine with this thing and keep it moving anyway. You also have access to a -1 to hit aura from the Dark Shroud, which can affect the Gladiators, but again, you also already have Smokescreen available to you, so that's not a particularly unique combo, but again, it is a free roll. You don't have to be spending that CP on it, so that's kind of nice. Now, last, but certainly not least in the sub-faction list, talking about Iron Hands, and I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that the vehicle-focused chapter has the most buffs for vehicles. Like, what a shocker. First up, we have access to another Signum array in Ironfather Fieros. Fieros also excellent synergy with the Gladiators, given that he can repair them for a flat 3 wounds, which is really nice to have around. Unfortunately, he does not benefit them with an invulnerable save anymore, so that is pretty sad. Giving a high wound count unit a 6+ damage ignore means that you have more chances for that 6+ to come into play. We mentioned before the Iron Hand's ability to double your wounds when you're tracking the bracketing of the vehicle on your datasheet, and just like we mentioned before, that is an extremely powerful ability for any of these vehicles. The Iron Hand Super Doctrine of reroll 1s to hit with heavy weapons is also excellent for them, because, I mean, obviously the Valiant is packed full of heavy weapons, and getting reroll 1s to hit on the Onslaught Gatling cannons on the Reaper is a really big deal. When you combine that with a +1 to hit, you could be hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, and get an almost 100% conversion. You also have access to, for really cheap, Methodical Firepower to set that unit back into Devastator Doctrine whenever you need to, so you can get access to those rerolls immediately. There's a little bit of a synergy between Optimal Repulsion Doctrines and Grav Pulse. If you are screening with one of the Gladiators, preferably one of the ones that's a little bit shorter range, Optimal Repulsion Doctrines can give you Overwatch on a 4+, and Grav Pulse can make it more difficult for the target to actually make that charge. So you can threaten the use of these stratagems to make a forward positioned Gladiator a very unappetizing charge target, since your opponent might 8 or 9 casualties on the way in, and then not even make their charge and just be left standing there to get blown apart by the rest of your gun line. Iron Hands also have a couple applicable psychic powers in the appropriately named Technomancy discipline. The first one being Psi Steel Armor to bring these guys to a 2+ armor save. Blessing of the Machine God is another access to a +1 to hit effect. Iron Hands also have one of the most infamous relics of 8th edition 40k, and that is the Iron Stone. This thing was an absolute nightmare for about 6 months with Repulsor Executioners, and now you can make it a nightmare with Gladiators too. It's actually one of the few vehicle combos that doesn't work with Dreadnoughts, since it allows you to choose a vehicle within 3 inches and give attacks against it -1 damage for the round, but it does not stack with other damage reducing effects. So it wouldn't stack with Duty Eternal on a Dreadnought. It does work just fine with those Gladiators, however, and can make them even more difficult to kill than a Dreadnought. So if you are bringing Gladiators or any non-Dreadnought vehicle in an Iron Hands army, I would absolutely consider inclusion of the Iron Stone in your list. On top of that, Iron Hands obviously have access to a whole bunch of repair abilities. They can reroll their repair rolls with a Fortis Data Spike. Adept of the Omnissiah can give anything the ability to repair or repair at +1. Ironfather Fieros repairs for a flat 3, and that can be on top of your Master of the Forge upgrade, so you can have 2 people repairing it at flat 3. You can just regenerate so many wounds. Speaking of characters as well, I should mention the Target Protocols Warlord trait. This one I don't think sees enough play because it is incredible. It allows you to pick a chapter unit within 6 inches, and when they attack in the shooting phase, they can reroll 1 hit roll, 1 wound roll, and 1 damage roll. That makes it's effectively the equivalent of a Death Skulls reroll from Orcs, but it's basically a souped up version of old school Master Artisans from the 8th edition Codex. For a unit like the Valiant that has a lot of D6 damage weapons, getting that damage reroll in there alongside the other benefits is a big deal. And for any of these vehicles that are making a low number of very high value attacks, having these rerolls available is a huge deal. So with that, we finished talking about all of the different chapters and their synergies with the Gladiator variants. So now it's time to enter the arena, give our final verdict on this data sheet, and see which one of these 3 Gladiators comes out the victor. I've done some math hammer and calculated some damage output for these vehicles in a variety of very common gameplay situations. For all of these, I assumed that the Gladiator had no upgrades or buffs on it. It was just a stock standard factory model without any weapon swaps or, pintle mounted weapons or anything like that. I assumed that they were in tactical doctrine, since most of the engagement in the game, or at least the meaningful engagement in the game, happens on turn 2. And I assumed that the vehicles were in optimal range. So that meant they were within range to rapid fire their weapons and get the +2 to damage on their melta weapons. The profiles that I pitted them up against were Guardsman equivalent, which are toughness 3, 5-up save, 1 wound models, Marine equivalents, which are toughness 4, 3-up save, and had 2 wounds, and then a Vehicle equivalent and a Knight equivalent stat line. Vehicle equivalent being toughness 7 with a 3-up save, and Knight equivalent being toughness 8 with a 3-up save and a 5+ invulnerable save on top of that. Obviously, for these last two, we're mostly going to be looking at the raw damage, since it's unlikely that you'll be able to overkill and destroy more than one model in a unit whenever you shoot at them. So we're just going to be tracking the amount of wounds that they do. Now, obviously, the first two categories are where the Reaper absolutely shines. Versus the toughness 3 enemies, it's killing around 18 models without any help. This means that once it's fully buffed up with all of the synergies that we just talked about, this thing could be ripping units of 30 models off the table in one go at a time. That's crazy damage output, and it's the most efficient points per wound that we have in any of these categories. The Lancer comes in okay at killing Guardsmen because it has those Stormbolters that can put in a couple extra damage, but the Valiant, unfortunately, with only 8 shots, is coming a little anemic when it's killing single infantry, but that's okay. The Valiant will rally later on. Versus Marines, the Reaper still holds strong, although is much less efficient. Unfortunately, the Lancer here is just anemically underpowered and does basically nothing. I should mention here that there is an issue for both the Valiant and the Lancer of overkill and excess wounds that are dealt. The Valiant especially, I think, averages like 18 damage into a Marine equivalent unit, but because it's only on 2 wound models, it's only going to kill an average of 4 of them. This means that against models with a greater wounds count, things like bikes or Bravis armored models, the Valiant is actually going to be a little bit ahead of where this appears. The Reaper at the same time is going to have a lot harder time punching through Gravis armor, given that its bolters are not going to be doing as much damage, and it has to do a full extra wound to kill each model. Versus vehicles and knights, this is where the Valiant takes right off. Against a standard toughness 7 vehicle, a Valiant deals an average of 15 damage. Basically, any toughness 7 vehicle will immediately be ripped off the table by this thing shooting at it. That's crazy. Knight equivalents have a little bit more survivability against them thanks to the toughness 8 and the access to that invulnerable save, so some of their attacks are going to bounce off. But neither of the other vehicle chassis are anywhere near as efficient at shooting at these high toughness units as the Valiant is. So now it's time to get to our final verdict and talk about which of these 3 variants is the best one. If you had to pick, which one should you build your kit as? Now, I have to say, and it hurts my heart because I love laser cannons so much, that I don't really see a place for the Lancer variant. It looks to me like it's been designed as more of a damage over time unit than a real hammer blow, and it's designed to sit at the back of the table and fire its cannon all the way across. It's clearly the longest ranged one out of the 3. It has a 72-inch range, it can hit anything on the table it can draw line of sight to, and pick at it for 8 or 10 wounds every shooting phase, which is, that's still pretty reasonable. The downside is that this is not a type of unit that's going to be very effective in scenario play in 9th edition. You can sit this thing on a back objective and maybe it can babysit, but in a lot of matchups, that distance isn't really going to save you, since enemy las cannons will just be able to turn around and shoot right back at it. So you really want this thing to be dealing as much damage as it can as quickly as possible before your opponent is able to take it off the board. And that brings it down to just the Reaper and the Valiant. Now, a big question here is the competition with other types of similar units in the Space Marine faction. And unfortunately for the Valiant, which I think is probably the coolest out of all of these, just being able to blitz through enemy tanks, like that's with no problem is super cool. But Space Marines right now have multi-meltas and melta rifles and las cannons just coming out of every orifice. They're just popping out of everywhere. They're deep striking in your deployment zone. They're coming off your backline from strategic reserve. They're infiltrating everywhere. There's a master of ambush with 6 eradicators somewhere over here. Oh my god. So that said, I don't think that Marines are gonna really need a 250 point tank to be able to shoot down the tanks that we're seeing currently. On the flip side, the Reaper, while it doesn't have a very good damage output against a lot of vehicles, still has a high enough volume of attacks that it can ding up toughness 7 vehicles pretty reliably. So if you do see them, it's not like a Reaper isn't doing anything. Whereas the Valiant, as we see from the stats, is extremely inefficient when considering points per wound that it does to Guardsman equivalents. That is to say, I would much rather have a Reaper shooting at my opponent's tank than I would having a Valiant waste all its multi-melta shots killing Orc Boys or something like that. So with that in mind, I think my verdict for the #1 Gladiator, the one I give the thumbs up to say, don't kill that one, other gladiators, is the Reaper. I think shooting 40 shots out of a single platform is super cool. It's always fun to roll that many dice, and it is very effective. It's even interesting to consider putting a bunch of defensive buffs on a Reaper and rocketing it up the table to get its maximum use out of its Tempest Bolters, and forcing your opponent to deal with this big thing that can potentially be -3 to be charged. With that in mind, I do think that the other 2 variants do have their place. Overall, would I take a Gladiator personally? I'm not sure. I don't think so. The points cost seems a little bit inefficient to me. Compared to a lot of other Space Marine units, they seem to compete very directly with a lot of other units in the Codex. A Valiant compares very disfavorably versus a whole bunch of Eradicators, for example. The ATVs that we just talked about in the last video are very much analogous to the Reaper, putting out almost exactly the same damage output. They only have Strength 5 weapons, and their AP isn't quite as good across the board, but they fire 42 shots versus 40, come in at around the same points cost, and I think are arguably more difficult to kill once properly supported. Honestly, with 9th edition's focus on standing on objective points and objective secured units, and units with high resilience, the Gladiator chassis felt like a little bit of an odd release to me. The unit archetype as a whole doesn't really jive with how Space Marines have been designed in 9th edition, and how objectives are even scored. That said, if you really want to include one in your army, they don't look too bad to me, and I think you can do a ton of damage with them. So that's going to be it for this review. As always, I hope you enjoyed, and please let me know down in the comments whether or not this type of video is for you. I am looking for some feedback since it's still a pretty highly experimental format of video for the channel, and I'm interested to see what the response is. Big thanks to all my patrons. You can see them up on the screen here, and you can join them at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. They get all sorts of cool stuff. They get early access to tournaments we run on the community Discord, exclusive content. They even got an exclusive version of this video with some stuff changed. There's extra content in it. It's non-monetized, so there's less ads in it, so that's really cool. It really helps out making all this content and running all of the events that we do over on the community Discord. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks again for watching. Keep it classy, folks, and remember to have happy wargaming.